So in this session, we're going to be talking about Toulmins Model of argument. As just kind of a preface, this is one way of making a full argument. It is and one theory of how to do it. There are multiple models and different theories of the best way to make arguments. You do not have to use Toulmins Model, but I will say that in my years of doing this, this is the one that students tend to pick up on easier, and the one that, in my opinion, works best for debate format, any debate that you do. So there in the chat is kind of like Anthony's note sheet. That is a note sheet you're more than welcome to download and kind of fill in as we go along. If you want, obviously you don't have to, but I will recommend that you take notes during this one because a lot of this might be new information. Unless you're one of my students from Kaohsiung. We talked about this in class, so this is going to be a review for y'all. But everyone else, this may be new. So, let me get my computer ready. Oh. All right. Okay. So my computer last week was being weird. So if you could, I get a thumbs up from some people if you can, once it loads. There we go. Can you see the PowerPoint? Did it actually pop up? All right, awesome. Okay. So Toulmins Model, what is it? Well, Toulmin, so argument and how to make an argument is as old as time. You can go back to ancient Greece with Cicero and Quintilian and Plato about, how do we make an argument? How do we convince people to make it, to believe what we have to say? Toulmin is one of the more contemporary ones. And he kind of took what a lot of people were saying and put it more into what I call a math equation for argument. So it kind of goes through a step-by-step process. We're going to go through each of these, and then we will have a breakout session where the students will practice actually doing these steps. And teachers, we're going to talk about different ways to incorporate teaching Toulmin into your classroom and the different options. So also, as a heads up, all of the lectures that we give, all the PowerPoints are going to be available for you. There's also worksheets for the teachers that we'll be sharing for quite a few of the different topics that you can use with your students as well. So all of the, plus the recordings are also going to be available. So as a heads up, if you were curious. All right. So a claim. A claim is one sentence long. That's it. Okay. One sentence long. And it takes a stance on a topic or an idea. A claim can be super big or it can be very narrow. It depends on what you're talking about at the time. A claim cannot be a question. It must end in a period, or some people would say, sometimes you can use exclamation points, but it cannot be a question at all. And it's going to either agree with the status quo or disagree or challenge the status quo. Status quo, for those that don't know, is just the Latin term for what is the current state of affairs given any topic. So what is going on right now? So, the status quo in my apartment is that the birds are really loud outside this morning. So it's just what is going on, okay? One sentence long. It's as short as possible. You don't want a really long claim because then it's hard to remember what the central idea is. You want to keep it short, to the point. The second step, so first we make a claim, cats are the best pets. Okay, that would be a claim. Super easy. Well, then what do we need to do? Well, then, according to Toulmin, we need to provide data or evidence, same thing. And this is research that supports our claim, that agrees with what we're saying, okay? In debate, what we do is everyone should be familiar that has done some type of NTNU debate of making cards. And in debate, we will show you this with our the evidence packet that we've created for you. We will quote directly what authors are saying from a couple paragraphs or a single paragraph to defend what our argument is. If we want to refer to an entire article, you can summarize in your constructive speeches. That is allowed. In Anthony and I's opinion, and in, at least in a lot of American public forum opinion, summarizing is not the best way. It's much better to first read it in the actual words of the author, and then second, start to summarize it in your own words in the summary and final focus and crossfire speeches. You should think of evidence as your building blocks, your Legos that you're putting together in multiple pieces to create an entire case. And it can be anything. It can be testimony. It can be anything that you find that supports. So maybe I find a study that says cats lower anxiety levels in humans more than dogs do. And that's my evidence for why cats are the best pets. So you do have to provide, and you should be used to this, an evidence credibility statement, okay? So who wrote it? And the very absolute least in debate, you have to give at least the last name of the authors and the date of publication. That's the absolute minimum. Best practice is to give us the author's qualifications as well. So to tell us, senior political analyst, somebody wrote in 2019 that, and then we quote them. So if my evidence, right, so I have my claim, cats are the best pets. Then I would say something like Dr. Smith, veterinary doctor at a Taipei university that focuses on pets, in 2020 said that in his study, he found that cats reduced anxiety in their owners more than dogs did. Okay, so that's claim, my evidence credibility, and my evidence. Super easy. There are two types of evidence, and this is where I really want you to kind of, we're going to have a discussion here. Primary evidence is firsthand direct account evidence. It is what comes from seeing it happen or doing the actual research and publishing about your own study. Okay, so an autobiography, anyone that's written anything in a peer-reviewed journal, anything like that. It is the best type of evidence to use whenever possible because, and this came up kind of in the last one, humans are biased, right? We have our own beliefs, no matter where you went to school, and even if you took the exact same teachers for everything, you still see the world differently. for insert however many reasons. So we use primary research because that will hopefully have the least amount of bias in it. It will also have the least amount of interpretation the farther you go, right? So that's what we hope with primary research. The thing to be careful, I will warn you this though, is always look to see why was a study written. So for example, the easiest example is that back in the 70s, in the 1970s, ExxonMobil, a huge oil company, paid scientists to do studies that proved that global climate change or global warming was not real, that CO2 didn't make things hotter. They actually paid scientists to create their studies so that they could be like, look, burning gasoline is great. Do it all the time. Well, we now know that's not true, right? So you have to be careful, look into who funded and why a piece was written before you absolutely believe all primary research. The other thing is I kind of have a rule of thumb with my debaters where they have to find something 3 times before they can make the argument that it's true. So at least 3 different sources have to say something very similar before they can try to make that argument as something that is correct, true, or accurate. And that's just to avoid, again, bias, misinformation, stuff like that. We then have secondary evidence. Secondary evidence is when someone takes a bunch of primary evidence and summarizes it or puts it all together. This is not the strongest. It can be used in debate and often is, and that's fine. But it's not the strongest because you have more levels of interpretation, more chances, especially if it is anything that has been taken from a bunch of different sources that are in different languages and all of them are translated by different people. You get things missed in translation. And so you have to just be very, very careful. We all interact with secondary all the time. Textbooks are secondary sources. Not that they're bad, but they are secondary sources. The reason you have to be very careful with secondary sources, and I use this example because it's the easiest, is because in the United States, there are textbook companies that were publishing history textbooks, arguing that slaves loved slavery. They were happy because they were singing songs in the fields. So that meant slavery was fine, no problems. No, that's not true. No. Needless to say, let's just, the one caveat is most of those songs were how to escape where you were because it was so bad, right? So history books, everything, right? When we get into secondary, we can get questionable things. So you want to be very careful using secondary resources. So that's my caveat to primary and secondary. You have to be careful. My other thing is opinion pieces. You have to be careful of using. So really look at the long URL of a website. For anything that's on the Huffington Post, a lot of the times, if you look, it'll have the word opinion somewhere in the URL. Not that all opinions are bad, right? Sometimes, or blog posts, sometimes lawyers, senators, doctors, all sorts of people will publish opinion pieces. And those are great to use. You just want to make sure whoever's writing it is qualified to be writing it, right? So for example, if I wrote an opinion piece about debate, I personally, I'm biased, but I would think that that's okay to use in a debate about debate. If I say, this is how debate should be. But if I write a piece on integral fast reactors and nuclear technology, don't believe me, because I don't know anything about integral fast reactors and nuclear technology other than the very, very basics. So just make sure you're checking for those things. All right, before we move, the next thing is your evidence credibility. Where does it come from? Right? This is, you have to know where it comes from. You need to know it. So especially for crossfire, if your opponents ask, you know, well, why should we believe this piece of evidence? You need to be able to answer all the W's. Who, what, where, when, why. You got to know all of them. And if you can't answer all 5 W's, you should be very careful about using that piece of evidence in your case, because that not having an answer to all 5 will make it harder for you to defend. So know all of these, be ready to answer all of these. Before we move on, what questions do you have about claim and then evidence or data? All good? Yeah, Nate.
Sorry, I was going for the hand raise, but so when you were saying secondary evidence, if you were still following the rule of 3 that you stated, and you found 3 different secondary sources of that information, would that be something you then would say, even though it's secondary, it still has some credibility there? Or would you be like, well, those secondary sources may all be taking from that same primary source, and therefore they may not have as much credibility?
So that's it's a really hard, there's no hard line there on what is best. I mean, you know, in the United States, I could find 3 different sources that talk about the minimum wage should be lower than it should be higher, right? So it's kind of questionable there. That's why, that's the why question of like, why was this published? And who was it published by are the most important. But I mean, in debate also, we will occasionally be using biased information because it's impossible. So as long as you can defend it and it's not, you know, terrible, no good, very bad, like we should enslave all humans.
Well, we ourselves will be summarizing and combining it in order to, you know, meet our own means in this debate. So you know.
Exactly. So yeah, we kind of create our own secondary. So there's it just be careful, know what you're using so you don't get something trapped. Yes.
It's not directly the question, but it's just you all have wonderful PowerPoints. Is it possible that if we could have it before we have our classes so that we could print them out and then write our note on the sheets? So it's just because you said that we will have the PowerPoint after the class, or
yeah, that's probably not today maybe, but definitely for the next few days we can make that available for you. Yeah, that's a good idea. So yeah, we'll definitely make that adjustment.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. Caleb.
Okay, hey Shana. I just wanted to add, because you did make a point about the types of evidence and its credibility, and I might just want to add a little bit of something for the kids, because there are students here. If you're looking at a research paper, usually they will write where the funding is coming from, and then like if it's a university, they will tell you it's grant, and then they'll give you a certain number, and then they'll tell you that there's no affiliation to any private enterprises. It means that they're not related to any private company funding. Yeah, so like you got to look for that, and if you don't have it, you might want to make sure that you search again or even email the author, because the author in some ways is obligated, although whether he or she will answer the truth or not is questionable at that point. Yeah, just adding that so the kids will know where to find it.
No,
yeah,
That's great. I didn't even think to include that. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And Anthony is going to go over in the how to research, how to use databases and listservs and all of that good stuff to find different things through research and like where to know like where things come from and all of that good stuff. But yes, that's a good point. Also, if you're reading something and the author isn't as clear as you want them to be, email authors. Authors love to talk about their research. It's like their favorite thing. You send them an email that's like, hi, I'm so-and-so. I debate. Our topic's this. I'm really interested. Can you help me? You're probably going to get more information than you ever wanted. But email people. My team and I did that one time, and an author was like, do y'all just want to do like an interview, like type up questions and we'll go back and forth? And we were like, absolutely. And we had an hour-long interview where we were able to ask, you know, like, well, what should the United States do about this problem? And he was like, here's 4 steps that the US needs to take. And we're like, awesome, thanks. So email companies, researchers, if they get to talk about and show how big their brain is, they love it. All right. So that's just a video that's included for teachers. The crap test though is great. We're not going to watch it. Come on. Go to the next slide. There we go. All right. So the next point, warrants. Please notice the stars. Please notice the first line. This is the most important part of Toulmin. This is the part that is left out way too often. So debaters, when I was watching NTNU, I judged policy while Anthony was judging non-policy. But what I found in the policy debates is way too often students will just read a piece of evidence and be like, awesome, thanks, bye, next thing. And I'm like, why? What do I do? And they wouldn't tell me why something matters or how a piece of evidence proves something to be true or not true. You have to have a warrant. All right. Think of your warrant as connecting your evidence to your claim. So the example we've been using throughout of cats are the best pets from Dr. George in 2020, who said that cats lower anxiety in their owners more than dogs, right? Now I have to provide a warrant in my own words about why is reducing anxiety the most important thing, right? So we could say that because cats reduce anxiety in their pet or in their owners, it makes life for the owners more enjoyable, therefore making cats the best pets for you to have, right? Super easy. Now, obviously, the more complicated the resolution is, the harder, you know, it is to write a warrant or to come up with your warrants. But you should always be using these. The biggest thing is to be asking yourself, so what, why, who cares, right? If you don't have an answer to one of these 3 questions, so what, who cares, or why does this piece of evidence matter, you do not have a warrant, which means you do not have an argument. You just have a claim and some people saying words. All right. This is the hardest part. This is the part that I will tell you debaters into their 4th, 8th year in college, right? Their 8th year of debate, if they've been debating all the way through high school, still have issues with. It's not the easy part. This is the hard part where you're really having to think through why you're using a piece of evidence. Why is an author saying what they are saying? Why should the judge believe you? Right? what do you do, or what should the judge do with this piece of evidence? Is functionally what it is. One of the biggest things, and my students can tell you I did this all the time, is they would try to make an argument to me, and they'd be like, they go through claim, evidence, and then they try to give me a warrant, and usually I'd be like, well, so what? Why does that matter? Who cares about that? And I could ask those 3 questions for hours until the students would finally be like, oh. And students are going to hate it. It's the most time-consuming part of teaching Toulmin. Students, it's the most time-consuming part of writing a constructive case, is really delving into and getting to the bottom of why something matters or why the judge should believe it. But this is where you should be spending a lot of your time. Nate.
So is this basically like when you're giving like, we'll say one of the things that Charlotte used to teach was ARE, which is, assertion, reasoning, and evidence. Whereas you're giving, assertion or a claim, then you're giving the evidence, and then the reasoning is the warrants that you're discussing, like why specifically. So basically, it's still the same thing that was being taught, but with a more critical focus on the reasoning as opposed to more critical focus on the evidence. Is that correct?
Yes. So Toulmin took ARE and said, in my opinion, I don't think it makes sense to give a reasoning before you give evidence. And so that's why he flipped the 2. He said, prove your evidence, prove that you've done your research, then explain to me why your evidence and your research matters. So yeah, it's just a flip.
Fair enough. Okay, that was what I was getting from all that. Cool.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, this is not that ARE is wrong. So if you have learned what Charlotte was working with ARE, what Nate just mentioned, it's absolutely fine to use and a good way to make an argument.
If you've done it well, though, that's still a critical thing. Is that reasoning is still, in my opinion, just like Toulmin, I just have learned it the other way around. But yeah.
Yep, exactly. So just being very careful with all of those parts. So yes. All right. So the qualifier. I'm going to warn you, if you try to go read Toulmin's writing about qualifiers, or almost anyone that is written about Toulmin and qualifiers, their language makes no sense. Don't read it. It took me way too long to decipher what it was, and I speak English. Qualifier in the simplest words is how true on a scale of 0 to 100 is your claim. Okay. So this is where we use possibly, plausibly, almost certainly, right? Qualifiers is where we agree. It's like, look, y'all, we know it's not 100% true, right? Nothing's 100% true, except that all humans die at some point, right? I could find an exception to the rule for almost anything. What this proves to your judge is, hey, I've done my research. I know there are outlying circumstances where my claim will not be true, right? So for cats, if you're allergic to cats and you can't breathe around cats, don't have a cat. They're not the best pet for you. If you have a phobia and you're absolutely deathly afraid of cats, obviously they're not going to lower your anxiety. They would increase your anxiety. So don't get a cat. But this is just where you're saying, even taking into consideration all of the other possibilities, all of the little small instances, we believe that our claim is the best in this instance. Now, some people are like, well, but won't judges, start to think more about the other side and then agreeing with me? And while I understand what you're saying and thinking, there has been lots of research on persuasion that has found that when you're honest with your audience and you say, look, I understand there are instances where I am not correct, but, and then you say why you're the most correct, your audience is more likely to believe you because they think you're being more honest with them, that you are demonstrating also that you have thought through all of the things that the other side could say, and you're defending yourself to be like, those things don't matter in the long run. So it might seem contradictory to be like, all pets are the best, cats are the best pets for almost everyone, right? It's actually better to admit that you know that cats are not always the best pets, or that social media may not 100% of the time be great for democratic values, but more often than not, it is, or vice versa. Nate.
Just chiming in here from policy debate, a lot of times if you make that claim that, you know, it's like all cats are all, you know, generally the best pet for everyone, you know, generally, or for most people, and then your opponents go after you and attack you, if that's your fear, you should thank them for that, because all they're going to do is give you more reasons to say, well, you're right, there are certain outlying things, but still, this proves that it's better overall. And so leaving that opening is almost like baiting a trap for your opponents. And if your opponents are smart, they're not going to go for that. And if they do go for that, and you have done your research, you have, you know, all this stuff to back you up, which makes you look good for the judges anyway.
Yep, that's exactly true. So don't think, students, that it means that the judge will believe the other team. It actually means that they will probably be more likely to believe your side. So that's making an argument, okay? Claim, data, evidence, warrant. Those three parts with the qualifier whenever necessary, that's making an argument. The next thing that comes up is the rebuttal. This is what happens. Anthony was talking about this with the burden of rejoinder. That is also can be called a rebuttal, and that's Toulmin's words. This is a rebuttal occurs anytime that you say your opponent is wrong. So anytime your opponent says yes, when you say no, your rebuttal is no. Okay? A rebuttal must have claim, evidence, warrant, qualifier when necessary. Rebuttals are not qualifiers. So just like where Nate was saying, if your opponent stands up and is like, but they're not good for people that have, the cats are not good for people with allergies. You're like, okay, thanks, you're right. But overall, that's a small number of the population, right? It's not. But a rebuttal could be, dogs are the best pets because they make humans more active. And then maybe have research that an active or a dog owner goes out and does walks or runs or whatever with their dog, which makes them healthier, and being healthier can therefore reduce anxiety itself, or exercise can reduce anxiety, and so that's why dogs are the best pets. You can attack the evidence. So you could say, hey, their evidence comes from a bad source. Their evidence, it uses too small of a sample size. Maybe it only, looked at 50 cat owners in the world. That's not enough. You can do a completely counterclaim and argument. You could even attack their warrants and explain why their warrants are incorrect or wrong. As long as you're going through the step-by-step process of claim, evidence, warrant, you've got a rebuttal. And this is what you start doing in those rebuttal speeches that Anthony was talking about. And so, when do we use these in real life? Students kind of ask me this all the time. They're like, okay, this is great, but when is this used in real life? Students, anytime you try to ask your parents to let you do something, you all are arguing and debating, right? When you're like, I would like to go out Friday with my friends, and your parents say no. And then you're like, but yes, that's a debate, right? You have the rebuttal is your parents saying no. And then your rebuttal to their no is you saying yes because of these reasons. And anything like that. So rebuttals, all of argument practice happens in our daily lives. Anytime we're trying to convince someone of something, you're having a debate. It may be informal, right? It may not be, okay, you get 4 minutes, then I get 4 minutes. We're going to go back and forth. But debates happen all the time. Where should we eat tonight? All of these things are debates. And you're going to find if you're one of the quiet people in your group and you're like, man, I really wish people listen to me more. If you start using this, like, we should go to McDonald's because your friends will start to listen to you a little bit more and your ideas will be more welcomed and used than what you might be seeing today. So this is a really good way to really start building your self-confidence, right? It's just answering all of these questions. What questions do you have about anything from claim through rebuttal? Nothing? All right. Oh, Caleb, yes.
Okay, Shanna. So I wanted to make sure about the rebuttal. When you said that we want to make a rebuttal, the difference between that and the qualifier is qualifier accepts the fact that there are exceptions, and the rebuttal is like a complete denial of the opposing side.
Correct.
And with that in mind, the rebuttal should include, you said include a claim with our own evidence. Is that it?
And your own warrants.
Okay, and your own warrant. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
However, just that qualifier, the quantifier that you were talking about, if your rebuttal is that their quantifier is wrong, you would still make that as your challenge, because you could say, no, actually, the other way around, it's less beneficial percentage wise, some other way. But again, you still have to have your reasoning. So that quantifier isn't excluded as much as you're accepting that it's not 100% one way or the other.
Yeah. All right. Okay, so that's another video for teachers and students to have access to. That's just another person explaining the Toulmin method. We are not going to watch it because he complicates it even more. So the last thing we're going to talk about is fallacies. And fallacies are anytime that an argument is made with some kind of mistaken understanding or belief, or where their reasoning is not well supported. Oxford Languages defines it, as you see, of a failure in reasoning which renders an argument invalid. So debaters, you should be, we're going to go over what the most common ones are, and you should be listening for these. And if you hear a fallacy, you should point it out to your judge and be like, look, this is a fallacy. Judge, you should not accept it in the round. You should instead listen to our argument because, and then explain.
Oh, good. Thank you for saying because. I'll take
Right. Yeah. Don't just be like, all right, this is a fallacy. Moving on. Always add because. That's your warrant. Anything that comes after because is the warrant. You have to have that. All right. So what are some common fallacies? Now, again, I have a video in here that goes over election season fallacies in the United States. We're not going to watch it. This is for teachers, obviously, if you want to use it. Come on, computer, you can advance past the slide. There we go. So what are some common fallacies? One of them is a false dilemma, where it can only be one thing or the other. President Bush was really famous for saying, you're either with us or you're against us. That's it. Well, what if I'm just kind of neutral? I don't really care, right? So false dilemmas are very common. Slippery slopes are very common. So something teeny tiny will lead to something gigantic. In policy debate, a joke is that everything leads to nuclear war. Does it really? I mean, I did win around way back in the day saying that if New York State legalized gay marriage, that we would have a worldwide nuclear war. Should I have won that round? No. Did I? Yeah.
Critics, I hate them.
But so you don't have a slippery slope whenever. Just, and if you point it out, be like, you want to talk about the likelihood, right? Like really something teeny tiny that we do is going to affect the entire world and make everybody go to war. No, come on. Ad hominem attacks or ad hom attacks are when we attack a person rather than attacking the argument or the thought process that is behind an argument. So this would be like if my opponents used Trump for their evidence for some reason, and my only response was, Trump is a Cheeto. Don't believe him. That's an ad hom attack. And instead of attacking Trump's argument, I'm attacking Trump as a human being. We don't want to do that in debate. We want to keep it professional on the level. Also, ad hom attacks you don't want to attack the debater or your opponent. So you don't want to say, listen, the con team is just stupid. They don't know what they're talking about. You don't want to do that. Yes, Nate.
Sure, ad hominem that is not necessarily attacking, for example, the evidence. If you were going to say this person is not a credible source of evidence, and then of course you still include the because, which is vital every single time. So you still could attack that source, but not attack the person.
Yes. So for Trump, for example, I could say we should not agree with or listen to Trump's arguments on international relations with whoever, because Trump has no formal training or formal research time that is spent in relations with those countries.
And he's contradicted himself on pretty much everything he's ever said.
That too. So yes, you can attack the evidence and the reasoning the author uses. You just can't attack the author as a human being. The next is a hasty generalization. For the individuals that did NTNU's non-policy debate this previous year, a lot of them started to notice that there were a lot of hasty generalizations in the research. Hasty generalizations occur when an author is using a very small population and then applying it to the overall grouping. So a lot of the studies that students were finding for the non-policy topic were looking at case studies or looking at only one school or one universities and how the students at that university felt about taking the English proficiency exam. This would be only a couple hundred students. And then the article itself would be saying, so this means that overall, completely for everybody, it's bad or it's good. And so you want to be very careful in your reading. How big is the survey? How many people did it look at? How many different types of people did it look at? And all of those things. Bandwagon, everybody, you should do it because everybody's doing it. In the United States, it's really popular if there's a baseball team that suddenly starts winning. You'll have a bunch of people be like, oh, yay, baseball team. I've always loved them. And you're like, real fans will be like, where were you when we were only losing? So you got to be careful of bandwagon. Red herrings happen. Red herring is when your opponent brings up something completely off topic to distract you. And it's like, oh, look at this shiny red object over here. Don't argue about the issues. Look over here. So, if we're talking about democratic values and social media, maybe, if your opponent starts talking about whether or not social media is just good or bad in general, that's a red herring, right? We're not talking about in general, is social media good? We're just talking about looking directly at democratic values. And then the last most common one is false cause fallacies. So sometimes you will hear the phrase correlation does not equal causation, right? What that means is, I'm going to put, excuse my spelling. Correlation does not equal causation means just because two things happen at the same time does not mean one thing caused the other thing to happen. Yes, you have to make sure that one thing A causes B. So there is an entire, I don't remember what the website is. There's multiple websites out there that people get bored and they love to go look up correlative things that have happened. The most entertaining one that I've found is that someone went and did a graph of all of the drowning deaths in the I believe it was the United States in so many years. Then they went and they graphed how many movies did Nicolas Cage star in, and they graphed that out. Then they compared the graphs, and the more Nicolas Cage movies there were, the more drownings there were. Trust me, Nicolas Cage has no effect on how many people drown. But the graphs are, they go in the same kind of trend. So you have to be very careful. Does X cause Y? Or is the cause of Y really W? Or, whatever. You have to be very, very specific. Something to keep in mind that NTNU does, and this is really smart on their behalf, is the guide, those study guides they give out at the beginning, have good evidence and questionable, not so good evidence. And they do this on purpose because as students and as coaches, you should be able to evaluate those sources. Are these sources that are good that should be using? Also, it prepares you of, if my opponent decides to use this not so good source, you should be able to have a response ready to go for it. That's like, look, here are the reasons why this source is bad. So NTNU does this specifically to test you and see who catches what are the good sources and what are the bad sources, which I think is actually really smart. Instead of just giving you amazing evidence, being like, here you go, it's all awesome. Being like, can you figure it out? Is really good, and it's a great teaching tool for everybody. So shout outs to that. All right, what questions do you have about Toulmins Model? Wrong button.
About the fallacies. So if I'm debating and my opponent have a fallacy, should I just state it which kind of fallacy they're using, or I just give the reason? Or
both. Identify what type of fallacy it is. Why is that fallacy bad? And why should the judge not believe that argument? Right?
Okay.
So the argument about blah is this specific fallacy, and therefore you should not believe it, judge, because it's bad for, and then finishing that thought. Caleb has a really good point about red herring. So actually, let me explain why it's called a red herring, because the evolution of this becoming a thing is really interesting. So back in the day, I'm talking like 1920s, 1930s, when it was a lot easier to escape prison or jail, one of the things people would do, or inmates would do, was they would take fish, hopefully herring, because it was really smelly. It had a very strong scent. and they would drop it to create a false trail for the dogs to follow so that they could hopefully escape in another trail. So they used it as a distraction for anyone that was following them. Also, farmers used it. They would use it as a distraction for coyotes and wolves to stay away from chickens and other farm animals to protect. So as a distraction from things. So that's where red herring came in. It came in, they called it this because it is a distraction argument that is made in an attempt to get your opponent to look at and start to focus on something that does not matter. So that then in the last speeches, you can be like, nah, okay, so don't worry about this argument over here that they spent all their time talking about. Let's just focus on this argument. And then your opponents are going, ah. So don't get caught by red herrings. You have to be very careful. If it doesn't matter, point it out to your judge, be like, this doesn't matter because. Yes, Nate.
So just Li Aichen, he asked the question about, does he need to point out which fallacy it is? And in all honesty, I hope you know what fallacy it is. But if you don't know the term, really as a judge, I think the majority of judges, we know the term. So all you have to do is say it is a fallacy and then focus on the because and then redirect to what is important. So if you get like, well, I don't feel comfortable saying it is, slippery slope or, red herring or whatever, just say, this is a fallacy. Here's why it's a fallacy and move on. And judges, we should already know what those are anyway, but point it out, just like fallacy done. Yeah. Fingers crossed that the judges.
Okay.
Yep. All right. Other questions? These are great questions, everybody. But yeah, red herring has a really interesting backstory of like how it became a fallacy. It cracks me up. All right. Okay, as always, if questions come up, you can send them to us at any time. If you want, you can send if it's like in the middle of the night, you have a question, you can email it to us, and Sylvia, who is in charge of the website, will share it with Anthony and I in the mornings. And then also every morning we'll have a what questions do you have session. All right. Anthony, are you ready for have you created the breakout rooms?
We have modified the schedule, so we're actually doing lunch.
Oh, that's right, because I can't follow a schedule. I'm stuck in the original schedule. Okay, so we're gonna go to lunch a little early today. On the second and third day, it'll be a little later in the day, around closer to 12:15, 12:30. When we come back, we're going to do breakout groups and practice using Toulmin for students, and then talking about all the different ways that you can teach Toulmin or any type of argument creation to your students. I've got some worksheets to share with you teachers. So any questions before we leave?
Yes.
Yes.
Is it possible that we could have the PowerPoint now so that maybe I could print it out during the break, and then in the afternoon we could use it if we need the note?
Oh, yes. Yes. Yeah, that should be doable. Just don't sign out of the meeting yet. When we release everyone, I'll go get a shareable version of the PowerPoint real quick and put it in the chat. It'll just take me a second.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other questions? All right, everyone, please be back ready to go at 1 p.m. Okay, is that right, Anthony? 1 p.m.
1 p.m.
Meaning
1 p.m.
sign in 10 minutes early, be ready at 1.
Yes. So be back by 12:50 so that we can start at 1 o'clock. All right. Have a wonderful lunch. And I'm going to get the shareable link. 1 second for the PowerPoint.